Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian. I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and we're very happy to have all of you here. And I want you to say hello to tonight's guest, Stephen Vider. Stephen, hello, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Where are we finding you this evening?
I'm at home in Ithaca, New York, where it just started snowing.
Well, you know, I'm here in Fort Lauderdale, and I think it was about 78 or maybe 81 degrees, but I'm not trying to rub that into you. But yeah, so the weather is a little bit different. I want to say everyone to say hello to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's here behind the screens. Hello, Paula. Nice to see you.
Hi,
Nice to see you. Thank you for your help this evening. And so we're very happy to have a conversation with Stephen this evening. Stephen and I worked together on a panel involving Gay Gotham at the Museum of the City of New York, probably, I don't know, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. Time goes by so fast. And so it's nice to see you and talk about your new book, The Queerness of Home, Gender, Sexuality, and the Politics of Domesticity After World War II. Just to let everybody know a little bit about Stonewall, we've been around since 1973. We're one of the largest LGBTQ archives in the United States. And we're also the largest LGBTQ library in the United States. The library has over 28,000 volumes, and they're all available. You can search the card catalog through our website at stonewall-museum.org. And we have about 5,000, 7,000 people a year who come and take out books. And so if you're in the Fort Lauderdale area, please stop by and come visit the library. In addition to the library, we have 2 exhibition spaces, which we draw primarily from our archives. And the archives, I said, is one of the largest in the US. We have 2,700 linear feet, which translates to about 6 million pages. I didn't really understand what 2,700 linear feet meant, but that's all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. And it's a huge trove of LGBTQ history, or really American contemporary history, from 1950 to the present day. Serials, subject matter files, you name it, and we have it. We're particularly strong in areas involving Florida and the American Southeast, but we have runs of serials from the United States, everything from Gay Community News in Boston to the Windy City Times in Chicago to the Bay Area Reporter. We have one of the only 2 known complete paper runs of The Advocate, which goes back to 1967 from Los Angeles. And so if you're interested in learning more about LGBTQ history or doing research, you can just contact us again through our website at stonewall-museum.org. We also do exhibitions, and the exhibitions are drawn mostly from our archives. We have 2 shows up right now. One is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which is about the relationship, the 250-year relationship between the US military and the LGBTQ community. We start with George Washington, who had a lieutenant who was in prison for sodomy back in 1776, I believe. And we end up with Joseph Biden, the current president, who actually removed all bans from LGBTQ individuals serving in the military. That show will be up for probably just a few more weeks, and then we're going to put up a show of wonderful portraits by the photographer Robert Girard, and portraits of writers that he did. He died of AIDS in the early 2000s, and everybody from Sarah Schulman to Jackie Woodson to Pomo Afro Homo to Silva Rivera. And so that show is really ready to go and will be up on the walls. The other exhibition we have now is Misinformation, which is looking at some of the early days of the HIV crisis going back in the 1980s and comparing the information that was put out and at that time about AIDS to what's happening today with regard to COVID. And for that exhibition, we pulled out quite a few of the books that have been taken off the public-facing shelves that had misinformation about HIV. We didn't want people to have access to that information should they seroconvert, but of course we wanted to keep them as part of gay history. And so we took those and then we added to that exhibition serials from the early 1980s as well too. And it paints an amazing story talking about dirty vaccines and politically protected diseases and how vitamin C would cure everything and all this other stuff, all this other nonsense that we've been seeing so recently with regard to COVID. And so again, both of those exhibitions, both Don't Ask, Do Tell and Misinformation are both up right now. And so please come by and see those. You can find us, of course, on the web at stonewall-museum.org. And finally, I want to do a shout out to one of our sponsors, which is the Rfund Foundation, which is an LGBTQ community foundation. And they're the ones who I just want to say thank you to because they've provided the support to be able to make this series possible. So I think I've done all of my homework here. And so Stephen, how have you been surviving the pandemic? How's it been going?
Well, I mean, I think Ithaca is in many ways a good place to have been this last almost 2 years now, or 2.5 years since I've been in Ithaca, but since March 2020, and I think one of the things we were talking about before is that I've been working on this book for I think almost 10 years, and it was really fascinating to finish this book under the conditions of COVID and lockdown pretty much lockdown and quarantine in Ithaca. So and at home. So I felt very lucky to be here in Ithaca through this.
And hopefully all your family, your chosen family and your blood family are safe and everybody's good and survived things well.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, and so Stephen, of course, received his BA from Yale, and he got his PhD in History of American Civilization from Harvard. And you're now teaching at Cornell, and of course, you were teaching there during the pandemic, and now you're teaching now. And tell us a little bit about what you're teaching at Cornell.
Well, I'm the director of the new public history initiative at Cornell. It kind of comes out of my public history work at the Museum of the City of New York on Gay Gotham at AIDS at Home. And one of the classes I've been teaching, I just finished it for this semester, is a class called Making Public Queer History, where we get to work with students in the amazing human sexuality collection at Cornell, which Brenda Marston built. It's one of the oldest LGBT and sexuality collections in the country. And it's just such, so wonderful to get to work with students with those archives, which are really wide ranging in terms of the material that Brenda has collected.
That's great. And just for those of you who are here, first of all, I want to say hello to our friends on Facebook. I see now that we're in Facebook Live, and so hello to everybody out there. And also, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to those questions as we go through the conversation here. I think of you as an academic writer. I think of you as a curator. I think of you as a historian. And I think, obviously as an educator as well, but this book, The Queerness of Home, is certainly a major tome and sort of a big foray into this area. Tell us a little bit about how it came about.
Thank you for that question. I really started thinking about the book around the time when a lot of same-sex marriage cases were moving through the courts. And one of the things I was really interested in, right, is that a lot of queer activists and queer studies scholars were very skeptical about marriage, about same-sex marriage as a goal for the movement. And one of the things that I felt like I noticed in a lot of the discourse and discussion was that there were ways that marriage and home were kind of being conflated, right? That people were talking about marriage and home as though they were the same thing. And I started to wonder what would happen if we actually separated marriage and home, and we started to think about home as its own thing and what types of possibilities it would enable. And so the research for this, was an effort really to try to uncover stories about everyday home life for LGBTQ plus people that hadn't been discussed as much. Because one of the other interventions that I really wanted to try to make is that so much of queer history and LGBTQ plus history has really focused on public activism. And I always think about the slogan, right, that gay liberation activists first used, right, of out of the closets into the streets, right? So out of private space and into public space. And I think, of course, that kind of visibility in public life has been really important in a lot of LGBT activism and LGBTQ plus culture. But I started to also wonder, what would we find if we actually started to look into everyday life at home? And also, where would we find that evidence, right? Because private life, especially for marginalized groups and LGBTQ people, right, has often been hidden, right? And even more hidden. So how would we begin to find that? So those were the questions that kind of got me started at the beginning.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because, drawing from my own personal experience and having a relationship, a long-standing relationship when I was in my early 20s, and this was in the 1980s. And of course, marriage was not something that I would even have thought about, but trying to replicate a married life, and that's what domestic life was about. As I think about the integrations and what you're speaking about in the book, that there were certainly many of us back when we could start publicly living together with somebody else back in the 70s and 80s. And even today, there are many same-sex couples that kind of emulate married life out there, which is the life that they saw growing up, or they saw on TV, or they saw someplace else. And that degree of domesticity seems so intertwined with in some cases monogamous, but not always, but at least a principal partnered focused relationship.
I think that that's a really important part of the story. But I think even the word domestic or domesticity, I think it because home life has been so important, right, in a certain kind of vision of American life, like since the 1940s, like since World War II and after, I think it's really hard to disentangle our idea of a certain set of domestic norms that center on, right, a kind of monogamous, heterosexual, family with kids, right? That's the model American family. But part of what interests me is thinking about the ways that queer people and queer and trans people have interrogated that, right? Have taken that mold and tried to expand it, break it, right? But in conversation with that norm, but also how what that actually reveals is not only that, it's not only that LGBTQ people are the only ones who had interesting home lives, but actually what I hope it makes us think about is that, there's the ideal of what American home life is supposed to look like. And then there's the reality, which is always far more queer than people think.
Yes, and I think too, when you think about in the 20th century, and of course, after the First World War and the Second World War, where so much of domesticity was wrapped up in commercialism, and we lived in an environment mid-century that talked about a chicken in every pot and a pot on every stove and a stove in every home, that home ownership and a domestic life that was one's own was really, gay or straight, one of sort of the highest things that the middle class could aspire to retain, and that those in poverty could aspire to. And I think that affected both queer and straight people.
And the larger question about what does it mean to belong? What does it mean to belong in your family, in your community? What communities can you belong to, and what role does home play in that? And something else that's interesting to me in the book is that, it's also, the book looks at a wide range of home lives that LGBTQ people work to make, and that includes kind of early gay marriages, which gay couples called themselves married in the 1950s, and they were not thinking about, right, that they wanted legal recognition. They were using the language of marriage because it was a model of how to have an adult life and how to be integrated into your community. But then later in the book, I look at things like gay and lesbian communes. And what's interesting to me there is that you have people working to create a new set of ideals and norms for themselves, but then also encountering the challenges of turning that into a reality, right? That there's always a challenge, right, in taking our ideals of what our home life could be, right? Home is about establishing a space where you can have control over the future, right? And so, but as soon as you start to set up the furniture, things start to get messy. And that's what the book is about. And that's what I mean also by the queerness of home, right? In not just queerness as in queer people, but the queerness as in the kind of strangeness of home as a space for holding all of our norms and ideals.
Yeah, it's the non-normative element of it. To that extent of queerness, you have a wonderful quote here by anthropologist Mary Douglas, who wrote, "The home is the realization of ideas." And then you add, "It is the materialization in space of personal and cultural ideas of what life should look like." And I found that quote to be both your language and hers to be very helpful in thinking about the idea, because and it resonated with me, of course, in the sense that yes, home does represent what my life should be like. And you used an instance, I think, at one point in the book where somebody said, "Well, I would never have my mother would never approve of me having a picture of a naked man on the wall." But you can walk into gay homes or queer homes, and there are things that we wouldn't associate with being in a home are there in that particular house.
Well, and I think that, that quote from Mary Douglas is one that is in some ways is really a touchstone for me. The home is the realization of ideas, because it's about the hopes that people have for their lives, right? Whenever anyone sets up a home, regardless of what their family life, both chosen and family of origin life looks like, that we set up homes with the goal of creating a space and structure for the lives that we hope to build. And that happens, when I say the materialization of it, right? That happens like both in the material objects that we surround ourselves in, the food we prepare. It happens in the structure of the house itself, the architecture, and also the people we bring into it, right? The people who live there with us, the people who visit us. Home is about always about this tension between who's included and who's excluded. And so for LGBTQ people creating home, they have to face those same decisions about who's included and who's excluded, both at the level of their home life, right, but also how that symbolizes the kind of community and world that they're trying to build.
Yes. So in your research and your thinking about a lot of this, I mean, obviously you must have seen different generations, because you, as you say, the book goes back to the end of World War II, which is 1945, and to the present day. And you've talked somewhat about relationships in the 1950s, but clearly you've looked at other groups and other relationships. What are some of the trends you've seen over the last few decades as you did research on this?
So I think that one of the larger, there's sort of an ebb and flow in the history, and there are lots of ways I think that queer and trans lives kind of mirror what's happening in the larger society, right? So gay people's fascination, and sort of support of marriage, right? Talking about gay marriage in the 1950s mirrors a larger kind of cultural obsession with marriage. And then similarly, right, in the 1970s, right, the development of gay and lesbian communes is also coming at a time when lots of people, right, from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different social movements are also thinking about communes as an alternative to the traditional family. I think for me, what I see as the biggest trend, and the one I think that has the most implication for us in the present, is that in the 1950s, queer and trans people tended to think about home as a space of privacy that protected them from the outside, right? That this is happening at a moment when going to a bar, right, or trying to meet someone outside or pick up someone on the street, right, that those were things that put you at great risk of police harassment, of arrest and violence. And so queer people and trans people turn to home as a space of safety and privacy against that kind of homophobic and transphobic culture. What begins to shift in the 70s and the 80s is increasingly thinking about the home as a space that's going to be protected by the state or by the government, right? So one of the chapters of the book looks at the emergence of early shelters for LGBTQ homeless youth in the 1970s. This is beginning around 1970, 1971, and with resonances into projects and programs for homeless youth into the present. But what we see is that these often start right with activist groups like gay liberation groups, these new homeless shelters. But then they also, then activists also realize that they can turn to the government for money. I mean, this is also at the height of kind of Johnson's Great Society, when there's a lot of public funding available. And they're no longer seeing like the government as a potential foe, but actually trying to bring government in, right, to support queer and trans lives. And that is a major shift. And so I don't think that you can understand how we get to the idea that same-sex marriage, right, that we need to bring the government into our lives, right, to recognize gay relationships. I don't think you can understand that shift without understanding this moment and this pivot in the 70s when queer people stop seeing the government as the thing that home is protecting them from, but start seeing the government as the thing that's going to protect their home lives instead and actually help them to build them.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because in some ways and I think you make this point, which is the fact that a lot of those early pioneers were looking for, not in a bad way, but we're looking for their piece of the pie as well too. They were seeing that other people's home lives were protected, and they wanted that as part of their bundle of civil rights that they felt they were entitled to as they looked at other marginalized groups. Or gain more rights out there as well. You mentioned this twice, and this may feel like a bit of a loaded question, but in your research on this, do you think that the investment the gay community, the larger LGBTQ community, has placed in marriage successfully, that it has been an energy well spent? Do you think that this was worth the time and the energy we've spent on securing the right to marry each other?
So that's a great question. And when I think about, that in some ways, I think one of the underlying questions of the book and that I'm trying to explore here. And I think that what I would say is that when the same-sex marriage movement began, that there was a lot of alliance between activists working for same-sex marriage, but with thinking about other kinds of family, right? Not thinking about things like domestic partnership and family recognition that weren't limited, right, to marriage. So, for example, I have another essay in the book called Intimate States, edited by Margaret Kennedy, Nancy Cott, and Robert Self, that just came out. And there I look at a really important key case, Brashy versus Stahl and Associates, which was a case from 1989, which was the first time that a court recognized a gay couple as a family. Brashy had been in a 10-year relationship with another man, but when his partner, Leslie Blanchard, passed away, the landlord of their rent-controlled building wanted to evict Brashy because his name was not on the lease, and that was a very, of course, that was a very common experience for a lot of gay men in the 1980s, around in the first decade of the epidemic. And what is fascinating is to look back at those court records is that you see that Brashy's lawyers from the ACLU were in alliance with thinking about lots of other ways that arguing for what they called the functional family, that there were lots of functional families that could be recognized, right? There were intergenerational families where you had people living with someone who was not their parent, but a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, right? You had also kind of other families of choice. And to me, that is there was a lot of potential in that early movement to think about the ways that government might recognize family in a more expansive way. And so I think that there are pragmatic reasons, right, that evolved over the last 30 years why same-sex marriage became the goal that other people have written about. What I think needs to sort of happen next, and which I argue for in the book, is that we still need a more expansive definition of family. And I sort of look to that early case with Brashy, right, that to think about functional family and the functional household, like how do people actually live as family life? How do they define family and home for themselves? That should be our guide, and that's what the role of government should be. And so if same-sex marriage is the beginning of that, I think that there's more work to do.
I think that's incredibly well said, because I mean, I come to marriage with the bias of the fact, it's a sexist institution based in, dowries and money and all those kind of things. And so I was always somewhat suspect, and I say this as a gay married man now, but I was always somewhat suspect of the institution and was never quite sure why that's where we wanted to put so much of our energy into. But what's interesting is that society being what it is, as a married gay man married to another man, I will tell you that the difference of walking into a hospital and saying, I'm here to see my husband, as opposed to I'm here to see my domestic partner, is completely different. And as long as those are the structures that society and the law acknowledges, then I think it does give us a lot of protection. The question that I think you're touching on here is whether or not we can actually get to a point where we have legal protection and marriage or family unit, which is beyond the core idea of two partners, and that it may be broader than that, and it may be some kind of relationship that we can have more attachment to. And also a major part of it is the respect that we get from other individuals out there in the world too. It's not about our own well-being, but it's really about how we're treated in the world. That respect is important.
I think it's also not a surprise that marriage became so important. I mean, the same-sex marriage movement really begins in the late 80s, and I think it's not surprising that this happens when it does, not only because of HIV, the emergence of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but also because this is a moment of profound disinvestment or cutbacks to social welfare programs. And so, one of the things that makes the United States unique is that there's so much that's tied to marriage, not only the social standing and respect of being in a marriage, but also things, of course, like healthcare and health insurance. When you remove all other types of social safety nets, all right, people need to pragmatically turn, I think, to the systems that exist to protect them in the present.
Yeah, and of course, that's what many of us want to survive or want to survive through our adulthood, to say, look, we've got 30, 40, 50 years of our adulthood, and we get to make these choices, and we want as few obstacles in the way that we possibly can have in order to get to that point. There's another quote that you have in the book from the Homosexual in a Society, John Leroy and Donald Corey. Quote, "Two men or two women who strive to spend the rest of their lives together feel the stigma against their homosexuality would be mitigated, at least in their own eyes, if the relationship resembled a regular marriage. For homophile writers and readers, homosexual marriage offered an aspirational model for citizenship, greater domestic stability," they argued. And I find that to, again, sort of, it is for so many gay people feeling like outsiders, that they wanted to have some degree of normalcy, marriage. And again, this quote was written in 1963. And I still think that rings very true for a lot of people today.
That chapter was really important to me to write about, about sort of why did gay and lesbian people invest so much in marriage in the 1950s and 60s, right before, by the late 1960s, 70s, you start to see a turn against marriage, right, which was not just among queer people, but among feminists, but I think we still live with a lot of those cultural resonances, because even if we're living in a moment, of course, of greater acceptance of LGBTQ people, there's still profound stigma about the types of sexual and romantic lives people live. And again, I think a lot of pressure, right, to conform to recognizable norms.
So we've talked a little bit about, or some about, the idea that a queer domestic space, it's societal and personal recognition of the relationship, and it's the objects, what makes a particular queer family space something else. What other big themes come out of your work that you want us to know about?
I think one of the big themes I hope that comes out of the book is to reorient us to think about home life as political, right? Regardless of how private or public it is, right? That home is inherently political, and that we're always engaged, and people are always engaged, right, in in navigating those political and cultural pressures. And what I hope we get out of that is also a revaluation, especially of the labor that happens at home. So the final chapter of the book looks at caregiving programs, like buddy programs for people living with HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, right? Beginning with the buddy program in New York City through GMHC, but then that model actually gets reproduced all over the country. And there's a level of care labor, again, that often happens in private, that I wanted to surface in that chapter, but throughout the book, to think about, right, the labor of home life as having a political significance. And of course, feminist scholars have pointed for a long time, right, to the politics of labor at home and the way that domestic labor is really devalued in our culture. And so one of the messages of the book is for scholars and historians and anyone interested in the past, right, to look back with a greater appreciation for the labor and politics of home life and home labor, and care work especially. But also, I hope that helps people to reevaluate their lives in the present. That lots of people, and I think this especially has become only clearer over the last 2 years under COVID, that there's so much kind of care work that happens in private, in domestic and home space, that isn't made visible, that specifically, I think, actually made invisible because it doesn't go so well with work, right? Because it doesn't go so well with earning money or working. And so there are lots of ways that home labor is made invisible. And I feel like it's really important, not just in our appreciation of the past, but also our appreciation of the present, to recognize, again, the importance of that kind of care work and domestic work kind of in general in the present.
I think that's a really good point, because I think I meant to mention this earlier, but of course, domestic life has been, again, as a 20th century phenomenon, been really devalued because it is something that quote unquote non-working women did at home. They were the ones who were sort of lesser in society, and we grew up with a lot of those tropes and ideas out there. And so here you have a group of individuals who know they're marginalized as a result of their sexual orientation. And then we want to look at their activity in something which society marginalizes as well too. But the beauty of it, of course, is that so many people have actually, just as you say, have turned that upside down and turned it on their head, and not allowed either one of those two evils to impede what it is that they want to do, which is basically to create a nurturing environment, which is the materialization of space of personal and cultural ideas. That's an incredibly lofty goal, and that, of course, is what you're talking about here. But it takes a lot of work to get to that particular point. Yeah, I know that you have some slides queued up. Let's take a look at those, because I think some of the images actually help us to understand some of this. And then when we finish those, I want to talk about sort of the three big sections of the book. So yeah, so let's share your screen.
Can you see that okay, Hunter?
I can. So with regard to the book, I believe you mentioned earlier, is due out December 24th. And thank you very much for sharing an advance copy with me. I look forward to having the printed version in the library, but people can pre-order it now. Where can they pre-order it?
They can, if they go to the University of Chicago Press website, they can pre-order it, and you can get, I'll just say, 20% off if the code is just my last name, Vider. So they can order it, pre-order it on the University of Chicago Press website, or also any other bookseller.
Great.
So, one of the things I wanted to just share a little bit, is, and I wanted to talk with this in part because to say that this book would not be possible without the incredible work of archivists and archives like the Stonewall Museum and Archives, because, the big challenge for this book in some ways was to try to uncover these stories, and to do that by uncovering the material evidence of it, right? That I always knew was going to be a challenge to find. And so photographs became really important to me, in the research and in thinking about the book, because I do a lot of oral histories. I did a lot of oral histories for the book, but it's also really hard to get at, right, the rhythms and the materiality of everyday life, right, as it's happening. And so photographs as a technology of capturing the moment became really important to me, in capturing space. And I'll just, I wanted to share a little bit of this to give a sense of kind of the types of stories that these images bring to us, right? So the cover of the book is an image that is maybe my favorite in the book. And this is of a group of young people who are at a place called Survival House, which was one of the earliest group homes for LGBTQ youth in the country, founded in San Francisco around 1973, and it closes in 1978. I mean, this photograph was taken by then a student at Berkeley named Bruce Pavlov. And I love this image in part because of all the tensions it introduces, right? That, of course, it's a beautiful photograph, but I think you get a sense of the connection among the people in it, but also the kind of ordinariness of playing a board game, right? Of a family playing a board game together, but also that it's Monopoly, right? Which in some ways represents, all of the ways that home and households and building, right, and the built environment are so embedded with capitalism in our culture. And I'm fascinated by this connection of of queer and trans youth playing Monopoly in this space, and also the way that this image just brings us into this moment. And like but these types of images actually were so important for me in thinking about just the whole span of the book. You know, one of the images that was really important to me early on is this image by Samuel Stewart, who was a writer. He was at one point an academic. He then became a tattoo artist. Justin Spring has a wonderful biography of Stewart, and this image fascinated me. This is actually an image of that Sam Stewart himself took. It's a Polaroid, right? That's of Stewart's Murphy bed, right? So this is a bed that would have pulled down from the wall. And if you pulled it down from the wall, you would see this mural that Stewart painted behind it. And I was fascinated by the ways that Stewart here kind of posed his lover, right, in the same kind of stance as the people, right, in the mural, right? The way that this embodied performance mirrors what's on the wall. And this for me was a real, I guess, materialization of that idea from Mary Douglas about the home being the realization of ideas, right? Here's a moment of materializing the idea and making it real, but also, of course, you know, Stewart writes about, you know, and keeps a diary of the many men that he brings back, of the many kind of sexual adventures he has in his home space. And so it also, I think, challenged immediately the idea that home was a normative space, to start with this image of Stewart's apartment. But also, of course, also wrestles with things like privacy. This photograph is only possible because there's a Polaroid camera, which was a new technology at the time that Stewart was using it, right? That you could take a photograph and you did not need to bring it to a Photoshop to be developed. You did not need to have your own darkroom. And so Stewart has an amazing collection of photographs that he took, like this one.
And just to underline the point with regard to this, for those of you, because Stephen mentioned it, but the Justin Spring biography of Samuel Stewart is called Secret Historian. And if you get a copy, find a copy of that, because it is really just an amazing trove of information. And there's also another book, which is Samuel Stewart's album of drawings, which is really just, I forget the name of that book, but you can find it, and you get to see all the drawings. Those are his drawings in the background, and he really wanted to be with men, and so the way he figured out how to be with men was to become a tattoo artist, and so he got to tattoo a lot of individuals. He's also known for something I believe known as the stud file. I think this is at the Kinsey Institute, where he kept index cards on everybody who he had sex with. I think there are over 2,000 index cards or some crazy number like that.
And just I think the book you're mentioning is called The Obscene Diary.
Thank you.
I just want to thank also the press that released that, Antinuous Press, actually was able to share a scan of this scan of the photograph, because of the time that I was finishing the book and getting images all together. The Beinecke Library, where a lot of Stewart's papers are now, was closed. So I should just thank Antinuous Press for that image, for sharing this for the book.
And he wrote fiction under the name of Phil Andros. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
He's a fascinating figure. And you know, this also for me got me think. This image also really got me thinking early on about the ways that domestic life is a kind of performance, right? Whether it's normative, whether it's radical, right? It's always a kind of performance. And of course, that's really clear here, but we're all embedded in the kind of performance, right? There's a way that domestic life, domestic space is a kind of stage where we're performing domestic life for ourselves and for others, right? Who come into our home.
Oh man, you know, that's such a good point, because if you think about, you know, going into a queer house to two gay men or two lesbians and doing something, there's a whole different series of expectations about the performative element of it compared to if you just went into a heterosexual house. I mean, there will be things that will happen that will be part of the performative nature of just being part of a queer household.
I think what looking at queer homes again do, though, is they also reveal that all domestic life, you know, is a performance, right? But we just don't notice it as much for for straight people because it's so embedded in the culture, it becomes normal, it becomes obvious. Whereas looking at queer home life actually exposes, again, the kind of strangeness of all domestic life as a performance.
Yeah.
So another set of photographs I really love in the book is this from the One Archives of a wedding ceremony that was held in Philadelphia in 1957. These photographs were actually never given back to the couple. They're cutting the cake here. They gave it to a drugstore to develop, and the drugstore owner thought that the images were obscene and would not release them back. And so eventually the daughter of that drugstore photo developer gave them to the One Archives. And again, thinking about all of the domestic stories that we've lost through those types of censorship. It's only by luck that so many of actually these early images come to us. This is another one from the Cornell University library of another, also in Philadelphia, a lesbian couple from 1953. And even in this photograph, you can see a kind of butch femme fashion happening right again, but also just the with the curtains drawn and the kind of domestic life that the couple here is building. And we don't know their names for this couple or the couple before. Then I think I love the contrast of the book too, right? Because we move then from gay marriages of the 50s and 60s to communes in the 1970s. And so this was a commune called Gay Liberation House in Washington, DC, where anti-racism really was crucial to their goals. And one of the things I love in this image is you might see that there's this kind of banner behind them, and they actually bring that banner to what would have been the second Christopher Street Liberation Day March, with now the kind of Gay Pride March in New York in 1971. And it says this is a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young play on the lyrics. Our house is a very, very, very gay house.
Right.
And I love the ways that this also, again, right, that one of the things that changes in the 70s is no longer is queer home life, right, just something to be kept private, but it's actually something that's important to be made visible, right, to make alternative forms of home life visible. This again are some other photographs by Bruce Pavlov of everyday life at Survival House for Fanny, Attila, and another resident. And Janice. And I'm so indebted to people like Bruce Pavlov, who, these are in Pavlov's own collection, right? But, there's one of the strangeness of queer domestic life or queer domestic history, right, is that it's hard to find evidence like this. And in many cases, working with photographers themselves and artists themselves really was crucial for the book to uncover some of these stories. Another important example of this is Susan Cookland's photograph of the Buddy program. And we think about caregiving, right, at the kind of in that first decade of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we might think that there's going to be no evidence of that, no evidence of the kind of caregiving that was happening in private. But then you find someone like Susan Cookland, right, who was there documenting all of this at the start. And photographs like this is an image we also used in AIDS at Home that is some of the images that's so important to me in the book, because it's really crucial to remember with this image. This is Kachin, who is a volunteer caregiver from the Buddy program with Michael. And there's so much happening in this photograph of this first with Michael wearing a Silence Equals Death t-shirt, right? So we think about Silence Equals Death image and the Silence Equals Death project, and we often think about ACT UP protests, and we think about public space. And so the idea of then finding someone wearing a Silence Equals Death t-shirt at home, right, of bringing activism home, really, I think, reorients the way that we think about queer history, about the history of HIV/AIDS, but then also just the physical and emotional intimacy of Kachin and Michael. And this, of course, is happening at a time when there's so much stigma about even being in the same room with someone with HIV/AIDS. And there's still, even though the science has expanded so much by 1987, there's still so much stigma and fear. And so to think about, right, the significance of this kind of care work here, here's another image by Susan Cookland, right, this kind of physical intimacy of changing people's lives, right, through this kind of, what I call it in the book, in-reach into people's homes, not outreach, but in-reach. And there are other things in the book too that are just so important, like Bruce Pavlov also has a documentary that he created at Survival House. This is one of the trans residents at Survival House. And then also work by people like Juanita and Mohammed Shapansky from the show Living with AIDS that was sponsored by GMHC and especially Jean Carl Musto, where, again, to try to find these traces of everyday home life, right? That this is part of, I think, also one of the challenges, but I also think one of the, what I hope the book also models is thinking about a kind of what I call a domestic archive, right? And thinking about both the challenges of uncovering that, but also the possibilities of uncovering this domestic archive or domestic history.
Yeah, and just on that point, I mean, I think it's so important for people either watching this this interview or for those that we meet, that trying to be able to capture and save these images, these very rare images of what domestic life was like. I mean, today, of course, we have our phones everywhere and there are 100 million pictures out there, or 100 bazillion pictures out there. But, I go back to some of those earlier images that you showed of that wedding that the participants had never seen. Those are incredibly rare glimpses of what life was like for those individuals, that they felt so, they trusted the community around them to actually record. They wanted to do the normal thing. This was a party that they were going to have, and they wanted to record it, and they showed themselves to themselves and to their peers in a very real way. And those things are just so incredibly rare to be able to find. And so if people have images, it's so important to make sure that those things are preserved and they get to your local neighborhood LGBTQ archive so that people can preserve these images, because this is all part of an arc that Stephen's talking about here, that the freedom that so many queer people have today living together is really sort of predicated on all of the work that's been done, just as this work is focusing on life that's happened after World War II. We're going to be running out of time relatively soon, but sort of just to take a little bit of a divergent tact, what did you find in the first part of the 20th century about domestic life? I know you had to cut it off somewhere, but sort of what was it? What were some of the trends that you found there?
You mean before World War II?
Yes.
That's interesting. I mean, I'll just say part of why I start with World War II is because it's a moment when home life has become so ensconced, right? Becomes politically significant in a new way through things like the GI Bill, right? That the government is kind of incentivizing certain forms of domestic life in new ways after World War II. And so, but of course, there's a lot of evidence, of course, of queer and trans domestic life before World War II as well. I think that the difference is that it's before the really beginnings of an organized gay movement. And so I think there's still lots of ways that queer people are building home lives for themselves, but there isn't necessarily a social movement structure to make political meaning out of it. And some of that, is covered in books like George Chauncey's book, Gay New York, right? Where he looks at the ways people are using apartment buildings in New York City, or things like the YMCA kind of domestic spaces, but there's something that I think shifts after World War II through a kind of new understanding of the politics of domestic life through these social movements. And that's sort of why the book begins in 1945. It's not only the larger cultural context, but also the specific ways that queer activists work to make meaning out of home.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we know about the Boston marriages in the late 20th century and I'm sorry, the late 19th century and 20th century. But I would agree with you that I think that that really was the beginning of a lot of what we consider today to be the current trend in LGBTQ rights. Well, so as we wind up here, I think about these three big sections in the book: integrations, revolutions, and reforms. And just kind of walk everybody, let's just sort of walk people through the importance of each of those sections and sort of how they intertwine with each other. So let's start with integrations and just tell us a little bit more about some of the bigger themes there.
So the first part of the book, integrations, looks first at gay and lesbian marriages, but then also at a book from 1965 called The Gay Cookbook, which was publicized in the New York Times, written about in Time magazine. And what was interesting to me there in integrations was thinking about the ways that LGBT people kind of in the 50s and 60s were trying to figure out how they might fit into this post-war domestic order, right? Where might they fit in this? And the Gay Cookbook pushes back a little bit, pushes back to some extent on the gender roles, right? But is also, I think, still really invested in a kind of privacy. And so that's different. What happens then in the next section with revolutions, right? So that's two chapters, one about gay communes, and then a second chapter on on Phyllis Berkby, who was a lesbian architect, and her vision of what she called lesbian or women-identified architecture. And there you're looking at people who, through gay communes and also lesbian architecture, are trying to totally overthrow the normative systems that came before them, who are totally rejecting of conventional forms of marriage, totally rejecting of conventional forms of the family, and trying to really imagine an alternative, right? Whether it's a commune. Phyllis Berkby, one of the projects that she works on is to, she goes around the country asking women to imagine what she calls their fantasy environments. Mm-hmm. And she asks them to do this because she thinks that architecture has been so male dominated for so long. And she's one of really still a minority of women in architecture at this time, right? Architecture has been so dominated by men for so long that in order to create a new kind of architecture, right, that might be more responsive to women, right, you need to start from scratch. You need to go back to imagination. You need to go back to fantasy. So then the final section of the book about reforms is then thinking about, right, sort of what comes after that and sort of how do we get to the present, this moment when queer and trans people are beginning to look more to the government as a potential source of support, both material support in terms of financial or economic support for programs like homeless shelters, but also recognition. And it's not, I think, an easy path, right? I think one of the reasons the Buddy program, for instance, so one chapter looks at LGBT homeless shelters, the next looks at Buddy programs. One of the reasons Buddy programs, kind of volunteer programs, emerged is because there is no government support in places like New York City, even in the 1980s, for caregiving for people with HIV/AIDS. And so queer people have to take that upon themselves. And so the question about sort of then is how do you hold on to queer and trans life and all of its variety and all of its beauty, right? But also strive for new types of recognition and support. And that, I think, is the challenge that we're still sitting with. How do we hold on to the variety of queer and trans home life while still seeking and recognizing the ways that recognition and support, right, from the larger social and political world really matter in our everyday lives. So we can't escape that. And so how do we balance that tension?
It's so great, and it sort of begs the question about, if you and I meet again 50 years from now, and we talk about, so what the next chapter is after reforms, and will it be acceptance, or will it be, destruction, or whatever that next word is? Of course, we don't know, but you certainly have brought this up to the present. So the book again is The Queerness of Home, Gender, Sexuality, and the Politics of Domesticity After World War II. University of Chicago Press, right? Yep. University of Chicago Press will be out in the latter part of December of 2021. Stephen will be talking about this book and being able to share it with everybody then. You can pre-order it through there or through your local bookstore. And Stephen Vider, thank you so much for being here. It's great to catch up with you. We're getting lots of thank yous in here now, and so people have enjoyed this talk. Please feel free, if you have friends who are not able to be here, they can go to stonewall-museum.org, give us about 72 hours, and it will be up there on the website. Plus, it's also available through Facebook as well too. So, Stephen, great to connect with you again.
Hunter, it's such a pleasure to see you again, and I just want to thank you so much for all of your support over so many years, and it's such a delight to get to talk to you about the book. Thank you so much.
And again, I'm totally serious when I say, if your travels can ever bring you down to South Florida, please come by. I would love to show you many of the things in the Stonewall Archive, which are just so amazingly on point, and particularly those personal things like those photos from the 50s and the 60s that are so rare to have these amazing glimpses into people's lives that they just never knew that archives would care about this stuff, and that historians would care about it 70, 80, 90 years later. It's just astonishing to be able to see it. So thank you. I look forward to working with you again.
Me too. Thank you so much, Hunter. And thank you everyone for coming. Really,
yes,
thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So we're going to be off until probably mid-January. Mike Balbin will be the next one, and then Sarah Schulman will be coming, I think, after that in February. So be kind to everybody and stay healthy, and we'll see you all soon. Paula, you back there? Thank you for all your help, Paula. And there you are. Thank you. And
thank you, Paula.
And so we'll see you all very soon. Good night.
Good night.